Greetings, colleagues. My name is P Bamu, and I work for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, or WeGo, and I'm from Zimbabwe, as you can see. So I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and how it has impacted on the world of work, the employment relationship in particular. And I will take a look at a particular case study on domestic work. In terms of the overview, I'd like to begin by saying that WeGo has done a study on the COVID-19 laws of countries all over the world, and we've looked at the implications for informal workers. The Africa regional work we're doing covers 41 countries, Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone. And the overview of my presentation is that we begin by looking at the COVID-19 response in Africa. And then we look at lockdowns and what they mean for continuity of employment. Then we look at social protection and stimulus measures. I'll then talk about preventative measures to prevent infection in the workplace and social dialogue, and then end with looking at the implications for domestic workers. So, in terms of the response, I think you'd all agree that March to June is what we would say has been the height of the lockdowns and the restrictions on movement, on work and certain activities and gatherings and so on. And then from June and July, there's been a gradual easing of restrictions with precautions. Some countries are exceptional and they've gone back into stricter measures. But for the large part of it, we are now getting out of the strictest of the lockdown measures. When we look at continuity of employment under lockdown, this has been critical because of the idea of the stay-at-home orders and the curfews, meaning that people could not move around unless it was for essential movement was essential. And one of the requirements was that if you were performing an essential service or you were employed where you were performing an essential service, you were exempted and you could commute or you could travel. And in some countries, an authorization certificate was required to enable you to maybe go through security checkpoints and so on. For workers who were not deemed to be essential, not necessarily that they were non-essential, but if you were not deemed to be essential, you were allowed to work from home if possible. And in situations where it was not possible to work from home because of the nature of the work, the nature of that sector, then the question arose about what is the contractual position when performance is prohibited. And different governments have adopted different approaches. In some countries, they've talked about variation of the contract. And that this would be achieved through the employer consulting or negotiating with the worker, either the individual worker or the workers in that workplace, or negotiating with the trade union that represents the workers. And in the regulations, countries have taken different combinations of some of the following measures. In some cases, workers have been required to take compulsory paid leave, which then restricts them if in a later part of the year they want to take leave, they no longer have leave days. Some employers are required to pay, even if the worker is not working, to pay the full salary or part of the salary where possible. And in some countries, they've authorized a furlough or an unpaid break, reduced working hours, sometimes necessitated by the regulations themselves, where they say certain services or companies can only operate from 8 until 4. That has an impact on working hours. And in some countries, layoffs and termination have been prohibited. So no retrenchments during lockdowns, although some countries acknowledge that after lockdown, if the company realizes that it's no longer viable, the employer can no longer continue, they can then go into the formal retrenchment measures. A few countries have also highlighted the importance of providing for leave for workers who need to isolate, workers who become ill and contract the virus, as well as those that have to care for family members who are either sick or who, for children, if there's no childcare, to actually step in and do that. Important to highlight that there's a lot of controversy around these regulations and the approaches that have been taken. In Namibia, the Employers Federation challenged the regulations, which required them to pay workers and prohibited layoffs and dismissals. This was actually contentious, and it resulted in the regulations being struck down, or these provisions being struck down. In Eswatini, the workers challenged a pay cut. So they were continuing to work, but their wages were substantially reduced. Failure to consult resulted in the court actually finding that the employer was in the wrong, and the employer was required to actually top up what they had paid to make it to what they should have, the contractual wage that they normally would pay the worker. Another important point is around social protection and stimulus measures. This is important where workers lose their income or their income is reduced as a result of layoff, as a result of even retrenchment or loss of their job during the course of the lockdowns or as a result of the pandemic. So social protection, I think the big key thing is that there has been some litigation against to challenge lockdowns, because some people believed that governments did not have enough in place to actually provide for lost or reduced income. So in Zimbabwe, Malawi, Uganda, there have been these challenges. Only in Malawi was it successful. So the lockdown provisions that were initially imposed by the government were struck down because of this issue of failure to provide adequate social protection measures. In Zimbabwe and Uganda, the courts found that the government had done enough to provide for those that would not be able to work or would lose their income. If we look at social insurance, the two main forms of insurance that would apply is unemployment. So if you lose your job or you're laid off, and then workers' compensation as well, if you contract COVID-19 in the course of your employment. And in many cases where this has been relevant, the rules have had to be modified to accommodate the peculiar circumstances that COVID brings up. And in some countries, there has been a concession to allow employers a concession exempting employers from paying contributions for social security funds in recognition of the fact that they would be hard pressed to pay the worker. So governments were saying rather pay the employee and never mind about the contributions for a certain period during the lockdown or whatever period was stipulated. Then when it comes to social assistance, this is non-contributory assistance, and it includes the COVID-19 relief funds that many countries have established. So what has been provided under assistance, basically cash grants, food and water, electricity and water subsidies. So for example, in Ghana, the government actually provided that the poorest households would have their complete bill paid for, and other households would have a certain number, I think it was 50 kilowatt hours per month for initially 3 months and extended for another 3 months. A few countries have also provided for school fees, relief on school fees, or for exam fees for those that are writing the national examinations. And then when it comes to stimulus measures, stimulus measures are really measures to keep businesses going, to sustain the economy. And these measures have included tax relief, soft loans, grants, and wage subsidies to enable employers particularly to pay workers. And in Eswatini, for example, there's a layoff relief fund. So you lay off, you can apply for funds to pay the workers. And the conditions for this is that you retain the staff. So you cannot retrench them, you cannot dismiss them for a certain period. Some countries have introduced training schemes or employment schemes for those that are unemployed. And as we are coming out of lockdowns, there's a realization that economies are contracting and we need to move from temporary and emergency type of relief towards long-term recovery, because many economies are in a recession. And how do we recover from this? So preventative measures have become very important, because all workplaces and homes, anywhere you go, there's always a risk of infection. So different countries have adopted different combinations of the following measures. These include screening and quarantine for those who are asymptomatic or who are symptomatic, or those who have had contact with people that are confirmed to have COVID-19. Physical distancing is another important aspect, where workers are required maybe to work on the basis of a rota, or where working time is reduced to limit the time over which people are exposed. In some cases, employers have had to limit the number of people that can be in the workplace at a particular time, and in fact have just said some people are working from home or they're laid off, and we have an essential or skeletal staff that are in the workplace. And then reconfiguring the workplace to promote physical distance between workers, as well as between workers and customers, clients, and anybody who comes into the work environment. PPE has been important, so employers are required to provide masks, gloves, and to enforce the requirements to wear these, not only for their staff, but for customers and people that are coming into the workplace. Cleansing and disinfection. This is also important, and employers have to have a regular schedule for this to be done, and to provide the tools and the disinfectants to make this possible. Personal hygiene requires people to wash their hands, so employers have to provide water and soap. If not possible, then they have to provide hand sanitizers. And importantly also, employers have been required to train the workers to understand what COVID is, how it's spread, and what preventative measures they should be taking as well. And two countries, Malawi and Namibia, have expressly provided that an employee can stay at home, so they can refuse to work if they feel that the workplace is unsafe. And this is without prejudice to the continuity of employment, without prejudice to their pay and their working conditions. This is in line with the Occupational Health and Safety Convention of the ILO, and some occupational health and safety legislation in countries that allow this. When it comes to social dialogue and consultation, negotiation around the regulations for COVID-19, we find that we've moved over time from governments looking at this as a health crisis, as something that is a government issue, and something that is an emergency that, an immediate and urgent response is required, to actually seeing it more as an economic crisis, and something that is affecting everyone, regardless of whether you're infected or not, and something that has implications for jobs, for livelihoods, for income, for social lives, and so on. And so it's this all-encompassing notion that, COVID is a huge phenomenon in our countries. So initially, we would say that the COVID-19 task teams were largely, government officials, technical experts, NGOs, and donors, in line with how, this crisis was initially conceptualized. And although in some countries there has been an expansion of the people that are represented, in large part we'd say that there has been a limited inclusion or allowance for the representation of employers, organizations, workers within these the strict COVID-19 task teams, councils, committees, and so on. But countries like Botswana, Lesotho, Liberia, Mali, Malawi, Mauritius have included these stakeholders. We also find another scenario where in some countries there are social dialogue structures that have been established to discuss COVID-19 issues. So they are not the main COVID-19 body, but they have discussions and agreements are reached, and the outcomes of those discussions feed into the discussions and the decisions of the COVID-19 task teams. And we see that in Kenya, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, a very interesting example as well, where the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, had a special committee on COVID-19. And just another reminder about Namibia, where the regulations were struck down. The Employers Federation challenged these regulations for failure to consult the social partners. Here's a picture of the Domestic Workers Union in South Africa, just highlighting the importance of the stakeholders. So if I were to turn to the implications for domestic workers, we chose domestic workers because they are amongst the most vulnerable. They're a very large sector in terms of employing women. They're also a sector that enables workers to work. So a very important sector, but also very vulnerable, and protections are quite limited. So we wanted to see what the implications are of all these employment-related regulations. To what extent are they recognizing or seeing the situation of domestic workers, and what is the impact of these laws, and what has been happening with COVID? What has it been for the domestic workers? So firstly, in terms of continuity of employment, and regarding the deeming of essential services, domestic work was largely not recognized as an essential service. So where you were required to be an essential service, to be commuting and traveling between places, if you were a live-out domestic worker who goes to the employer every day or goes to a different employer every day, then you were not allowed to actually do your work. The exceptions would be in Angola and South Africa. In South Africa, this was as the lockdown restrictions were being relaxed. They allowed the live-out domestic workers. In Namibia, there was some recognition, but not of domestic workers, but of people who care for the sick, who care for vulnerable workers and for children. And then if you were a live-in domestic worker, the logic is that you're in the workplace, you're not moving around, so you would typically be allowed to continue to work because it's happening in the private household. The only thing would be that it would be difficult for you to leave and to move to another place on the basis that you're going to your family, coming back on the basis that you're coming to your employment if you are not deemed to be essential as an occupational group or sector. And then working. So for domestic workers, their employers were either working from home, having children at home, and so for some that was an intensification of the work that they were doing. In some cases, their employers maybe were retrenched, or they were not working, they were laid off, or it was impossible because they were not deemed to be essential. And so in some cases, workers found that their employer was not able to pay them. And this resulted in different scenarios. In some cases, domestic workers were working and unpaid. In other scenarios, they were temporarily laid off. So maybe when the employer felt that they would be comfortable, they would, they promised to call them back. In some cases, they were dismissed because the employer said, look, I've lost my job and it's not possible for me to have a domestic worker. Some employers actually felt that if they're working from home, there's not much of a need to have a domestic worker. So different scenarios played out. And what we found in terms of the research is that the domestic sector has been one of the hardest hit by retrenchments in some countries, for example, in South Africa. So we were finding that they were quite expendable. And I don't say that in a positive light, but very easy to dismiss. And this has been difficult for many workers. And typically, if you are dismissed or if you're retrenched, you are entitled to benefits on termination. Only one country talked about this, and that was Zambia. in the case that they actually wanted to exempt employers of domestic workers from the obligation to pay 25% gratuity that the law ordinarily requires. So it's 25% of your total earnings over the contractual period. Employers have been exempted from this. When it comes to social protection and stimulus measures, in many cases, domestic workers are not registered for social insurance, your unemployment, and so on. And so then they wouldn't qualify for whatever benefits were being provided, workers' compensation. In South Africa, this has been one of the countries where domestic workers have been excluded, although that is in the process of changing. But a good example is where South Africa actually provided for the temporary relief scheme, the COVID-19 temporary relief scheme, to cover domestic workers, even if they were not previously registered. And that was really a result of litigation to challenge the government for not allowing unregistered people to claim benefits. Then domestic workers may qualify for social assistance that is extended to all citizens. So maybe food rations, cash grants, and so on. They would potentially qualify. But in many cases, the social assistance that governments have provided has been quite limited, maybe to a certain number of households or to certain groups that are vulnerable, including people that have been unemployed in the long term, the aged, or the poorest households. And in that regard, some domestic workers would fall between the cracks. And then when we look at stimulus measures, they've largely been reserved for companies and not for households. So not much relief there. In Mauritius, there is a reference to uncategorized workers being able to receive the funds. We don't know what exactly it means. We don't know if it would allow, for example, for domestic workers to be protected, but largely they have not been included. Okay, and then moving on to the health and safety. It's important to highlight that there are very, very high risks. And often when we speak about frontline workers, we've been talking about nurses and doctors and so on. But frontline workers really talks about workers who have had to work and who have been highly exposed, either because of the nature of the work that they do or because they are limited protections. And so we consider domestic workers to be frontline workers. Why? Because there's close contact with the employers and people who are coming in a private household. In many cases, domestic workers have been caring for those who are sick, and sometimes without actually being told that this person has COVID, or without access to testing to make sure that they're fine and so on. And in many cases, domestic workers do not have privacy. They might not have their own room where they sleep. So they might be sharing a room with family members, and that also exposes them. And domestic workers are also responsible for cleaning and disinfection. And there are lots of reports that employers have become very paranoid around cleaning, and cleaning having to be done many times in a day, and the harsh chemicals also affecting the workers, their hands and so on. And in some cases, employers want to limit their own exposure, and they may send the domestic worker to go and shop and to do errands for them. And that also exposes the domestic workers. Are the preventative regulations that I spoke about applicable to domestic workers? In principle, one would say yes. But if you look at the fact that labor law in many countries, the definition of employee might exclude a domestic worker, you already have a problem. Secondly, when we look at the wording of many of the texts, they talk about institutions taking measures, companies taking measures, industries taking measures. And that seems to limit the application of the regulations to those who are in the domestic sector. Then, the domestic sector is one that is largely, hidden. What happens there is hidden. Implementation is limited, and it's difficult to enforce against employers in a household. And there might be issues around awareness. There might be issues around capacity. There might be issues around costs. We have reports of some employers saying we don't even have enough masks and gloves for ourselves. How do we provide them for you? Then there are questions around social dialogue. Where is it happening? This is, if we look at the domestic sector, where it's actually happening, where governments are getting together with employers, governments are getting together with workers. The discussions have been largely business-oriented, industry-oriented, and domestic workers have not had as much of a say or have not had as much prominence as we would have liked to see. Here's a picture of a domestic worker who's cleaning and, just reiterating this idea of constantly cleaning and disinfecting. So in conclusion, we've highlighted that domestic workers are such an important sector, a vulnerable sector, limited regulation, limited bargaining power, either as individuals or collectively. Unions are not as strong. And we are seeing that there's a high risk of job loss, high risk of wage reduction, high risk of infection. But in the regulations, we are seeing limited recognition, limited mention, limited acknowledgement of work that's happening outside the formal workforce of workplace of a company, a mine, and so on. And protections that are tailored to these workers are actually we haven't seen anything very specific in most cases. And the question then becomes, as we are moving out of COVID-19 regulations, we are looking more around economic recovery programs. How will they address the plight of domestic workers? We should also look at whether in the more medium term, there might need to be modifications to labor law to respond to some of the challenges that arise, because COVID is still with us. It remains a challenge. And for example, precautionary measures will continue to need to be taken. So the question is, what is actually going to happen? How are workers in general going to be protected? And what's going to happen to domestic workers in particular? Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.